Welcome to this episode of Gun Shorts. In today's episode, we're going to talk about Remington's amazing 1148 semi-automatic shotgun. We're going to tell you a little bit about the shotgun's history, talk about the variations, the different models or styles of the 1148 that they made, talk a little bit about how to date your shotgun, and if you have one of these great old shotguns, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how it works, how to identify the model, and talk a little bit about why it's so amazing in the history of Remington firearms. So what was it that Joe said we have to learn to bridge the difference between the urban and the rural? Well, Joe, I'm going to go out and take advantage of what it means to live out in the country in one of those flyover states. I'll see you back at the studio. Remington Arms, the brand, though it has suffered so much indignity over the last 20 years, is a storied company worth its place in American history. Though this video is about the model 1148 shotgun, it's hard to pass by without giving at least a cursory shout out to Remington the company. Much good work has been published about its history, and I have no intention of trying to compete with it here, but let's take a quick journey into the company's past. Remington, in its earliest days, was an iron forge. Built sometime between 1812 and 1814, it was the hostilities of 1812 that provided the incentive that Remington needed to put his plan into effect. Though at the time, according to Alden Hatch's book, Remington Arms and American History, Light, as was Epaulette's nickname, had not dreamt of becoming a firearms maker. Light entered a shooting match in the autumn of 1816. Shooting was a major sport in America at the time. This was 20 years before the first baseball game was played at Cooperstown. Shooting for food and survival was an essential element of life, and shooting for sport was a way to display a skill which many were most proud. Shooting sports at the time was a social occasion, populated by both the men and the ladies. Light attended this match wearing black broadcloth and a beaver hat. Remington placed second in the match using a firearm that he had built at the forge. The winner of the match approached Light and asked him who had made his rifle. Light told him that he had, and the champ asked him how much he would charge to build him a barrel. Remington told him $10 and he'd have it done in 10 days. Light was in the gun business. Remington had its start in Ilion, New York, a village on the banks of the Mohawk River. Ilion was strategically located in such a perfect place that, following the creation of the Erie Canal, westward movement up the canal and the river would feed the need for an increasing number of firearms for adventurers and the inevitable settlers of the westward expansion. Remington, like most of the early manufacturers, would supply guns for both the civilian and the burgeoning military. But most of what Remington built was for a growing civilian market. As demand increased, so did the factories. The first to expand was the new forge built in 1835, which would become the armory. By the mid-1800s, the armory became a factory, and the factory occupied a major footprint in the village. 1914, with the advent of the First World War, the factory grew again, and clearly by 1956, one could wonder if Remington and the town of Ilion weren't all the same thing. But it was 10 years earlier, 1946, that the shotgun which is the subject of this video was being designed and created. Let's get back to the studio. This is a Browning Auto 5. So you might ask yourself, well, what does that got to do with the Remington 1148? Well, it turns out it has almost everything to do with it. The Browning brothers of Utah designed what is considered one of the earliest semi-automatic shotguns, and they did this in 1905. The action itself is relatively simple. The bolt locks into the barrel, and with the recoil of the gun, the barrel slides back into the receiver, pushing the bolt along with it. When the barrel and the bolt extend to its most rearward position in the receiver, it ejects the spent shell, picks up a new round from the tube, and then a large spring inside the receiver returns the entire barrel and bolt forward and locks it back into battery. So we'll remove the retainer cap, pull the receiver carefully off. You can see this large spring is putting forces forward on this ring on the barrel that brings that entire bolt and barrel forward into battery. Back inside here in the stock, there's another set of springs, lighter springs, that allow the entire mechanism to come back in a controlled way. Now, I've done a couple restorations on these Auto 5s, and you can see one of those restorations in one of my earlier videos, and I'll put a link to that in the description. But what the Browning brothers did is they approached Remington, and then Remington did an agreement with the Brownings to manufacture this under the Remington name. And the earliest version of this for Remington was called the Model 11. And the Model 11 looked essentially like a copy of the Auto 5, except for, in my opinion, maybe just a little bit bulkier, a little bit heavier, as opposed to the Auto 5, which tends to be a little bit more diminutive, a little bit smaller in its profile and in its size. Remington manufactured that Model 11 through the early parts of the 20th century. And then following the Second World War, Remington hired an industrial design team to come in, and they streamlined what was the Model 11 into the version that we're talking about today, which is the 1148. Now, the gun was first introduced to the market in 1949, and it was in continuous production until 1969. Now, I have a small collection of these that I want to bring in and put on the table, and while they're here, I want to talk about the small variations in models, and then talk a little bit about how we might be able to date these shotguns. So let me get those things up here on the table. Now, I have one gauge of each of the 1148 model that Winchester made. So I have a 12, 16, 20, 28, and a 410. And at the end, I have a real special one that I'd like to show you as well. So the 1148 was sort of revolutionary in the way that Remington manufactured firearms, because it ushered in the era of stamped steel, and we're used to that today. Bill Ruger started doing a lot of stamped steel on his Mark I handgun. So this idea of using stamped steel sort of became much more prevalent back in the late 40s into today. Now, the receiver and the barrel are machined steel, but a lot of the components inside are stamped steel. Now, another change that Remington made is they started using aluminum as a component or as a material in the manufacture of these. So, for instance, the trigger guard housing is all aluminum with steel parts inside. The loading gate is pressed steel. So another interesting one is that the 1148 also ushered in this really true concept of interchangeable parts. Now, a lot of manufacturers, even today, to assemble these guns requires a lot of gunsmithing. So a lot of these parts have to be fit. So another significant change is that this entire lower, or this entire trigger guard housing, there's two pins and this thing just comes out. They just pop out, and you can then have full access to clean the housing. You can then get inside to do additional cleaning inside. So that was another pretty significant change, because that trigger guard housing contains so many of the parts required for the gun to function. I've already mentioned that the the Auto 5 or the Model 11 had 2 springs, and the truth is that they incorporated that into this firearm as well. And you're going to see similar features to the Auto 5. It's a long one. So as we let that barrel forward, the forearm comes off. The forearm is designed in a very similar fashion to the Auto 5. You have the spring, and again you're able to remove the barrel from the operating rod itself. You got this large barrel and bolt return spring with those additional smaller buffer springs down inside the back or inside the receiver itself. Now this is a 12 gauge, and I would put it in probably 85% condition. The bluing is all pretty much intact on this thing, not a lot of wear on it. The aluminum, which typically gets a lot of wear, there's very little wear or any wear really on that aluminum. A lot of the coloring that they put on will often get chipped off. The stock has its usual dings and that kind of expected wears. But the gun itself is in really, really good shape. Not particularly remarkable pieces of wood, pretty plain walnut, but still. One of the other things that Remington did is Remington went in and then they added this checkering, all right? And I'm thinking that this is probably a pressed checkering pattern. I don't see a lot of strong cut lines, but it may have been cut. I'm thinking not, but maybe if you out there know if Remington did cut checkering on these 1148s, I'd be interested in knowing that. The checkering pattern was pretty much the same throughout the entire production life of the gun. Another thing that Remington changed with the 1148 from the Model 11 or the Auto 5 variant is they changed the friction ring. So they went from the Auto 5 or Model 11 had this brass friction ring that you would flip depending on whether you were using, depending on the loads that you were using, so that you could then vary the amount of restriction that was imposed on the spring as the gun was fired. Remington on the 1148 designed this new friction ring so that it was self-adjusting, so that you weren't constantly having to switch your friction ring based on the loads that you were putting in. So that was pretty innovative as well. Now Remington made a few variations of this gun. They made the 1148 in all these They made the 1148 in different gauges, but they also made something that they called the Sportsman 48. Now the Sportsman 48, it's the same gun. It is an 1148, but what it is, it was a variant that was designed to accommodate differing hunting laws by different states, for instance. So the 1148 can only contain 3 total shells. And the magazine itself had a crimped section that didn't allow any more rounds into that lower tube. This Sportsman 48, the condition on this is really high. The bluing is really in excellent shape. The wood, again, having some of those dings that you would expect from a gun that's being used. Again, not abused. A little bit nicer grade of walnut. Going back to the 16 gauge, this thing is just plain beat up. Has several cracks along the wrist area of the receiver. The bluing. This was a well-used gun, so the bluing has has been worn in a lot of spots, but again, in the spots that you would expect if somebody were using the gun a lot. You can also see the aluminum trigger guard has a lot of wear along the sharp edges of that. So that's something that you'd want to look for if you ever wanted to consider collecting these things. So again, that wear. There's a chip on the toe here. This one's well used. My 28. I would put the condition of this one probably in 75 to 80%. The bluing has a little bit of wear issues up in the receiver, not a lot, not too much. The wood itself actually has very few dings. It does have a few. Barrels in excellent. The bluing is excellent. The receiver is excellent, but I do have a lot of that wear in that edge along that aluminum trigger housing. All right, but this thing, I get excited about this. This 28 is so diminutive. It's so small. It's so easy to handle. And that was one of the things that Remington did with these that really did make them popular with Sportsman, is they shrunk the size down. They lightened these guns up so you could spend a day in the field and not be worn out at the end. This 410, I would put this at probably, again, 80-85% condition. There are a few issues with it, not a lot, but again, these are older firearms. They've been around for a long time, so you would expect to see the amount of wear that you see. The butt plate, the plastic butt plate, has a really significant chip out of it, but it didn't damage the wood when it did. So one of the things that if you go to the Remington Collectors site and you look at some of the information that they have on the 1148, they talk a lot about, how do you date the gun, and one of the concerns that they raise when they talk about dating it is that the date itself shows up on the barrel. So if we wanted to date any one of these shotguns, we would roll it over, and right in this area on the widest part of the barrel are the date codes. So one of the things that they would say is that because the barrels and the receivers are easily separated, that these barrels are basically interchangeable. So a lot of times folks would damage or buy additional barrels. So if those date codes may not represent the manufacturer of the shotgun itself, and I suppose that might be true, because oftentimes these guns would go back to the factory for repair or modification. But what I've noticed, or what I've learned, this is the little 410, and I checked almost all of them, that if you remove the barrel from the receiver, on the retainer ring or the spring ring, on the spring ring, there is the serial number. So you can match that serial number on the barrel to the serial number on the receiver itself. So it doesn't give the entire serial number on this block, but it does give the last 4 digits. So the serial number last 4 digits is 2341, and then if you look here, it's 2341. So you know that this barrel is original to the firearm itself. Now, those date codes that I was talking about exist right in this area on the gun. Again, you have to go to the Remington Collectors site. And they have a pretty extensive chart that describes the manufacturer dates, and you can discover the month that it was manufactured and the date that it was manufactured. So for instance, on this Sportsman 48, it is ZZ is the code according to this chart. All right, and I'll put a link to the Remington Collectors Club in the description. ZZ says that this gun was built in 1953. So you get a good sense of how long this gun's been in existence. So it was in the earlier days of production that this gun was manufactured. This one is the Sportsman 48 in 20 gauge. It has a date code of YY. So if we look at YY, that's 1952. If they have a single letter that precedes it, you can often know what month that the gun was manufactured. I don't see any of that here. Also stamped on there what the choke is. The Sportsman 48 is a full choke. The 12 gauge is also a full choke. So that's pretty tight. The 16 gauge is modified. These are pretty tight chokes. Let's see what the 410 is. 410 is full choke. My 28, I believe, is modified. No, it's full as well. It's full choke, but we've taken our share of partridge with it, so we know it shoots pretty well. All right. I want to show you one more gun that's kind of special, and I want to get all this cleaned up off the bench. So I'll bring you back and I'll show you that special 1148. Now this little shotgun is a very special 1148. Now it came through the retail shop years and years ago, and it was sort of unloved because it's during a time when most shooters, most shotgunners were moving away from blued steel and wood gun stocks to all black or camouflaged or plastic. So a lot of these older wood and steel guns, they just ultimately, at a time in their lives, became, like I said, just sort of unloved. But truly, by this point, a lot of what Remington was producing for shotguns were sort of being redesigned from the model 1100, which is an extended version of this, to the 870s and all those different shotguns that Remington was making. By the time this shotgun was being manufactured, it was sort of the end of the breed. Now, what makes this special is it is a skeet version of the 1148. It's very tiny, it's diminutive, it's a 410. It has this raised rib that is designed to give you a very flat sight plane with two beads on the top of it. Tell you a kind of an interesting little story that I got. I'll read this because it says that the skeet grade model 1148 had a streamlined look that was designed by John Vassos, who was RCA's foremost industrial designer, credited with designing radios, broadcast equipment, and the first mass-produced television for RCA that was seen at the 1939 World Fair. He was a decorated veteran of World War II and was the chief of the OSS spy school in Cairo, Europe, from 1942 to 1945, and was responsible for training all the agents that were sent to Greece, the Balkans, and Italy. Fascinating story. When I look at the date codes on this, the date code that matters, and I've actually checked the barrel serial number matches the serial number on the receiver, so I know that this is original to this gun. But the date code on this gun is RP, and if we look at the table that's supplied by the Remington collectors, the R is the month is November, so this gun was produced or manufactured in November, and P brings us to 1967. So again, it's very late in the production years of the 1148. When I look at this, what's really special about this is that if I were to put a condition level on this, and 100 point being like new. I would put this at 98, maybe 99%. There's absolutely no wear on the bluing. It is just immaculate. I look at the aluminum. That aluminum looks like it did the day it come out of the factory. All of the stamped steel, all of the chrome or polished parts, there's absolutely no rust, no pitting. Same with the bolt. The bolt is immaculate. It shines like it came out of the factory. All the pins are excellent. The wood on this is probably a slightly higher grade of walnut. The finish is a little bit higher grade of finish. The checkering is a little bit different on this from the other ones. It has more of a modern style checkering. This checkering, I know for a fact, is a pressed checkering, and I mentioned that I wasn't sure if the earlier ones were pressed, and I asked if any of you knew the answer to that. I'd be interested in knowing that, but this is definitely a pressed checkering on this. This gun is just stunning in its condition and its originality. The gun is so light, and it comes up so nice and comes right to the eye when you're shooting at the round pigeons that we're looking at. Here's something else that makes this gun also a little bit special. It comes with the original box. This just doesn't happen as often as you might want it to. You open the box, and the original manual is in the box. The original plug for reducing the amount of rounds that can fit in the tube is in the box. On the end is all the information for the gun. It has the serial number on it as well, so I know that the box goes with the gun itself. This is a tremendous look back into history, because so much of this is exactly the way it came out of the factory, and you just don't find that very often. And when you do, you want to try and pick it up and do the best that you can to preserve these things for the future. All right, that's my story of the 1148. Really, it's a fascinating story. It's a fascinating gun, fascinating history of Remington, and how it fits into the design world, or how it fits into the lineage of all of the different firearms that Remington made. And again, because this is sort of the first semi-auto shotgun that Remington designed on its own, makes it all that much more interesting and special. So, 1148. Now, if you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, if this is your first time here. Ring the bell so you get notified the next time I post a video. I'll see you in the next one.